together was to give you an overview, as it were, of the world's financial system. So quite often, when we come together for presentations on current events, we put up a lot of headlines and have a look at things that are happening, but sometimes we don't step back and try and see the big picture, as it were. So the whole purpose of what I'm going to go through today is to try and have a look at the global financial system, to stand back a little bit and have a look at how some of the recent events that are happening fit into that big picture perspective. So that's a bit of an idea on what we're going to try and achieve today. Now, if we're going to have a look at the global financial system, probably the first thing that we have to just for a moment consider is the global financial crisis. And the reality is, whenever I start talking about things like this, I'm sure a lot of people, first of all, are sort of sitting there and going, well, wasn't that like years ago? That was 2007, 2008, surely. Why would we be coming together and talking about things like the global financial crisis? And especially for us in Australia, and I know for Canada as well, that the experiences that we had of that financial crisis, it really wasn't overly severe compared to a lot of parts of the world. But the reality is, brethren and sisters, that the things that caused the financial crisis have not been addressed. The solutions that were put in place were very short-sighted and short-term and have not addressed the problems that existed at that time. And in actual fact, in the 7 to 8 years since the global financial crisis, the problems have got much, much worse. And the reality is, the leaders of this world, through their lack of courage to make the decisions that really need to make, their lack of courage to make the decisions which they did need to make, have set up a scenario where it's not if we're going to have another crisis in the future, it's just a matter of when. And the reality is, when that crisis does actually come upon us, it will be far worse than the last one by the very virtue of the fact that the problem is now so much larger. So what are we going to try and cover this afternoon? Well, first of all, we're just going to ask a simple question. How much is $1 trillion? When you start looking at the global financial system, you end up talking about numbers that are very, very large. And I don't know about you, but I've never spent $1 trillion. So it's very hard for me to try and contemplate what that looks like and how much it really is. We're going to have a look at a few recent global events. We'll consider how our financial system currently works, try and identify the main problem with it, have a look at how this all fits into Bible prophecy, a short case study on Greece, a short case study on the United States of America, and then we'll conclude. So as you can see from that, I've got an awful lot to try and get through in just over an hour. So I'm going to move quite quick, and you may not grasp everything that we're actually going to consider. Don't worry about that, because we'll try and just bring it together at the end into a few short, concise points that you can take away. So let's get into it then. How much is $1 trillion? And sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, so we'll just have a look at a few items of money. So on the screen there before you can see a $100 note, a $100 US note. Everyone's generally familiar with what a $100 looks like, no matter what currency you might actually hold. The next picture on the screen there is $10,000, so it's 100 $100 notes in a pile. You can put that in your back pocket, you can walk down the street and no one would even know that you had it there. That's $10,000. The next picture there is of a man, and at his feet you can see, I don't know how well you can see that from up the back, but he's got a pile of money at his feet. That's $1 million in $100 notes. You can fit it in a backpack, fit it in a sports bag, and you can really carry it around quite easily. That's $1 million. If you were to get a pallet of $100 notes, that is $100 million. So a standard pallet, 1,200 by 1,200, $100 notes piled up, $100 million. Therefore, if you were to get 10 of those pallets, you would have $1 billion. So 10 pallets stacked with $100 notes is $1 billion. Now, prior to the most recent financial crisis, we would hear the terms of millions and billions, but after the financial crisis, we then had terms like trillions. And a lot of us aren't really aware of how much difference there is between $1 billion and $1 trillion. We might understand it theoretically, but our experience with it is completely different. So on the screen there is $1 billion. How much more is $1 trillion? Well, what you see there is pallets stacked with $100 bills, but what I want you to note, and you probably can't see it at the back there, is those pallets are now stacked too high. Okay, so if we have a look at the previous one, 10 pallets stacked one high, $1 trillion is now that many pellets stacked too high. So it's an awful lot of money. Just a couple of useless kind of facts on $1 trillion. If you spent $1 every second, it would take you 31,000 years to spend $1 trillion. My favourite one is this one. If you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you 2,739 years to spend $1 trillion. That kind of gives you the idea of the amount of money that we're actually talking about when we start dealing with these kind of figures. Just imagine spending $1 million every day and then having to do that for 2,739 years just to spend $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a million. And I've got there recently the US government spent that amount in a day. Now this slide's actually from a few years ago, and that was related to a piece of legislation that the United States government passed where it was going to spend $1 trillion. So you can see that we're dealing with massive, massive numbers. And I want you to bear that in mind as we start putting together some facts and figures about the financial system. What are some of the recent events that have taken place in the world just in the last sort of 3 weeks? You may have heard of some of these, you may not. The first one is the Puerto Rico debt crisis. Okay, so what we've got happening in the world right now is countries starting to go broke. Puerto Rico, the government came out and they said, look, we've got a lot of debt, we can't pay that debt, so we're going to default on it. That set in chain a whole series of events where basically they've now issued higher taxes, there's a lot of uncertainty for the residents, their bond market then went and collapsed, which means their interest rates have gone up, and the reality is for that country right now, they're facing a situation where they're now being nicknamed Puerto Rico, because the reality is that their economy and their situation is such that they are going to see a much reduced standard of living in the future, all because of too much debt. The next one we'll quickly talk about is Greece. Been in the news a lot. In reality, Greece has been in the media since 2007, 2008, when their crisis actually started, where the government actually had too much debt, had to be bailed out. And in the media right now, we're seeing that the final negotiations are taking place for their third bailout. Most recently, the banks have been closed for well over a week. People in that country were only allowed to withdraw €60 a day from their accounts. And the reality is, once this third bailout is pushed through, which it may or may not do, Greece is in a far worse position than it was before this crisis actually started. Even though these whole bailouts are supposed to make the situation better for Greece, they've done nothing but make it worse. Angela Merkel there, what's going to happen next with Greece? And the third one is the Chinese stock market crash. Okay, so Puerto Rico is broke, Greece is broke, but in the last few weeks we've also seen a crash in the Chinese stock market. China is now the second largest economy in the world, very close to challenging America for the largest economy in the world, and when their stock market crashes, it ripples through the entire financial system. Now, what's the issue with China's stock market? Well, in the last 12 months, it's basically more than doubled in price, and then in a period of 3 weeks, it's dropped by over 30%. Now, when any kind of global market like that drops by 30%, it causes a huge amount of grief for a lot of people. But probably the most worrying thing about what's happened in China recently is the steps that their government has taken to intervene to prop up their stock market. Now, essentially, the Chinese government has come out in the last couple of weeks and said, look, we're now going to make it illegal for people to sell their shares. So you can go and buy shares and that's all good. But now, because things aren't going so well, you can't actually sell them, okay? Because people were wanting to get out, it was causing all these problems, companies were defaulting, people were going bankrupt, so their answer is just to ban people from selling. It's now a criminal offence that they are actively prosecuting people when they do this. So, unprecedented kind of steps which really don't bode well for the future of any kind of stock market, that's for sure. And I am moving quick, but we just want to touch on what is the key thing that's caused all of these three disasters or crises in the last few weeks. And I want to put it to you, brethren and sisters, that the major problem that we see, not only in these scenarios that we've just considered, but in the world as a whole, is a staggering level of debt, a crushing level of debt that is having the effect of causing all kinds of problems. And just to prove that to you, Puerto Rico, if you can see on the screen there, their debt has just kept going up year in, year out. Basically what they would do is they would borrow money this year to pay off the interest on the debt from last year. And they just keep going and going and going until they reach a point where it's mathematically impossible to make the debt repayments. Greece is in exactly the same situation where its debt to GDP ratio just keeps rising. Their debt burden is at a point now where it is basically impossible for them to ever repay the amount of money that they actually owe. And most of the world actively recognises that. What about China's stock market? How is that related to debt? Well, what we see on the blue line there is the price of their stock market going up. The red line is the amount of margin loans, which are debt instruments that you use to buy shares, has gone up at an unbelievable rate as compared to their stock market. And we sort of have seen that as a percentage of the total value of their stock market, the debt in that is now 18% compared to sort of 2.5% and 1% respectively for the New York Stock Exchange in Tokyo. Now I'm going through these numbers very, very quick, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point that all of these crises that we've seen in the last few weeks are solely because of too much debt. And this is really what we're going to be driving at for the majority of the presentation today, is debt and the problems that it's causing through the world. But before we go any further, I just want to digress for a moment and consider this concept here of distress of nations with perplexity. In Luke 21, we quote it quite often. We read this, "And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." So it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? And we quote this all the time, there's going to be signs in the sun, in the moon, in the stars. And we go, yeah, and upon the earth there's going to be distress of nations. But as we've already seen in our first study this morning, it's just amazing how unbelievably accurate Bible prophecy is. And there's lots of little details that are given to us that just add to the picture that we're presented with. Because we're told here that there's going to be distress of nations, but it's going to be characterised by something, and that is perplexity. So what is perplexity? Well, if you have a look at Vines, it just says perplex, or perplexity, so that didn't help me too much. If we look at a literal translation, it says, at a loss for a way, finding no solution to their embarrassments, being at one's wit's end, at a loss for how to proceed, or without resources. So the whole idea then, if we put all of those concepts together, is that there's going to be distress of nations upon the earth, but when they consider the problems that they've got, they'll realise that no good outcome is possible. When the leaders of this world are considering what options they have, they're going to say, look, every option that we've got is actually bad. And the reality is that there is no solution to the problems that currently exist that do not come with horrific consequences. And we see that in whatever area of life we look at the moment, where there's all of these issues in the world, but they're associated with perplexity because there is no solution that really addresses these problems for the long term. And so it's an amazing little fulfillment of Bible prophecy there, and it's something that I strongly believe we need to look at very closely as we continue to watch things develop. Have a look at this idea of perplexity. Have a look at the problems that this world is facing, see the distress of nations, and see the perplexity that's associated with it, because it's really interesting. Okay, we've said already that debt is one of the big problems. If we're going to understand how debt works and all of that, the first thing we need to understand is how money works. Now, the reality is that for something which is so vital to our everyday lives, the vast majority of people don't understand money. They don't know where it comes from. They don't know how it's created. Even a lot of people that actually work full-time in the finance industry itself, quite high level in banks, still could not tell you exactly where money comes from. So we just want to spend a little bit of time now explaining where money comes from, because I think you will be quite interested when you realise how the system actually works. And when we do understand how the system works, it helps us to understand the events that are taking place in the world right now. So the first thing to understand about money is it actually comes in sort of two different forms. First of all, there's physical cash, the stuff you've got in your wallet, notes, coins, things like that. And then there's electronic money, money which is in your bank account entries, digital money it's also called. So there's two different types of money. But who creates this money? Where does it actually come from? Well, I'll put it to you, brothers and sisters, that money is created in two ways. Money is created by central banks. Now, what's a central bank? Well, in Australia, we have the Reserve Bank of Australia, okay? That creates That's our central bank. In the United States of America, which is where our example will come from, they have the Federal Reserve. That's one place that creates money. The other place that creates money is the commercial bank. So what's a commercial bank? Well, that's like the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, Westpac, NAB. They're commercial banks. And both of those places create money. So what we want to do now is just step through a little video that just explains how money is created.
Here, we're going to explore the process by which money is created. Let me introduce you to John Kenneth Galbraith. He taught at Harvard University for many years and was active in politics, serving in the administrations of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson, and among other roles, served as United States Ambassador to India under Kennedy. He was one of a few two-time recipients of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Clearly a pretty accomplished and stand-up kind of guy. About money, he famously said, "The process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled." What he meant was, even after hearing how money is actually created, you still won't want to believe it. So if you don't get this segment on the first pass, don't worry, because money creation is truly a bizarre thing to ponder, let alone accept. But it's not because it's difficult. Any normal 10-year-old child could understand it. First, let's look at how money is created by banks. Leaving aside for now where this money comes from, suppose a person walks into town with $1,000, and luckily a brand new bank with no deposits has just opened up. The $1,000 is deposited in the bank, and now the person has a $1,000 asset, their bank account, and the bank has a $1,000 liability, the very same bank account. Now, there's a rule on the books, a federal rule, that allows banks to loan out a proportion, a fraction of the money they have on deposit, to other people. In theory, banks are allowed to loan out up to 90% of what people have on deposit with them, although, as we'll see later, the actual proportion is much closer to 100% than 90%. But for our example, we'll use 90%. Regardless of the actual amounts, because banks retain or reserve only a fraction of their deposits, the term for this process is fractional reserve banking. Back to our example. We now have a bank with $1,000 on deposit, and banks do not make money by holding on to it. Rather, they make their living by borrowing at one rate and loaning at a higher rate. Since any bank can loan out up to 90% of any deposits on hand, the bank in our example manages to locate a single individual that wants to borrow $900, and so the bank loans them $900. The borrower then spends that money by giving it to another person, perhaps his accountant, who in turn deposits it in a bank. Now, it could be the same bank or a different bank, but that doesn't really change how the story gets told at all. So let's keep it simple and make it the very same bank. With this new deposit, the bank now has a fresh $900 to work with, and so it gets busy finding somebody who wants to borrow 90% of that amount, or $810. And so another loan, this time for $810, is made, which gets spent and redeposited in the same bank, meaning that a brand new fresh deposit of $810 is available to loan against. So the bank loans out 90% of $810, or $729, and so it goes until we finally discover that the original $1,000 deposit has mushroomed into a total of $10,000. Did you follow that? We went from a stranger ambling into town with $1,000, but now there's $10,000 floating around town. Is this all real money? Oh, you bet it is, especially if it's in your bank account. But if you were paying close attention, you'd realize that what we've actually got here are three things. First, we've got $1,000 held in reserve by the bank, $10,000 in total in various bank accounts, and $9,000 of new debt. The original $1,000 is now entirely held in reserve by the bank, but every new dollar, all 9,000 of them, was loaned into existence and is backed by an equivalent amount of debt. How's your mind doing? Is it repelled yet? You might also notice here that if everybody who had money at the bank, all $10,000 of them, tried to take their money out at once, that the bank would not be able to pay it out because, well, they wouldn't have it. The bank would only have $1,000 hanging around in reserve. Period. You might also notice that this mechanism of creating new money out of new deposits works great as long as nobody defaults on their loan. If and when that happens, things get tricky. If, however, the debt defaults exceed the fractional reserve lending rate, it's a complete disaster. For now, I want you to understand that money is loaned into existence. Conversely, when loans are paid back, money disappears. In our example where our happy little town has $10,000 floating around greasing the skids of commerce, if everyone paid back their loans, the town would have to limp along on just the original $1,000. This is how money is created, and I invite you to verify this for yourself. One place is the Federal Reserve itself, which has published a handy comic book from which I drew this fine example. You can find a link to that on the Peak Prosperity website under Essential Articles. You may have noticed that I left something out that's very important here, and that is interest. You might be asking yourself, wait a minute, where does the money come from to pay all the interest on all these loans? If all the loans are paid back without interest, we can undo the entire string of transactions, but when we factor in interest, there suddenly isn't enough money to pay back all the loans. Clearly, that is a big hole in this story, and so we'll need to find out where that money, the money to pay off the interest, comes from. In doing so, we'll also clear up the mystery of where the original $1,000 came from. So, what was the purpose of all this? Why did we spend these past few minutes studying the mechanism of money creation? Because, in order to appreciate the implications of our massive levels of debt, you have to understand how that debt came into being. That's one reason. And the more important reason is related to all those exponential graphs we viewed earlier in Section 3. But we're not quite there yet. First, we need to travel to the headwaters to find the original source of all money. Where did that original dollars come from in our banking example? To find out, we need to go visit the Federal Reserve, the place where money springs into existence. Please join me for Chapter 8, the Fed.
All right, so hopefully that was a bit of information for you. Maybe you knew about that, maybe you didn't. But the reality is that we saw from that example that miraculously $1,000 enters into the banking system, and by the time it works its way right through the entire banking system by being loaned out and redeposited, that $1,000 turns into $10,000. $1,000 in original cash, $9,000 of loans, all backed by new debt. Most people aren't aware that that's how the financial system works. Essentially, most people think that you put money into the bank just loans out that money and that is it. If you do the numbers, you realise that there's no way a bank could ever make money out of doing such a thing. Now what I'm going to do now is play you the next section in that video series that we just looked at. And look, this is the last little video clip that deals with theory, okay? So just bear with me for another 7 or 8 minutes. Because if we can get an idea of how this whole system works, it just opens up a huge amount of understanding as to why the things that are happening in the world are happening the way that they are. So let's just deal with the next section now.
Now we're going to travel to the headwaters to discover where money is actually created. The process works like this. Suppose Congress needs more money than it has. I know, that's a stretch. Perhaps it's done something really historically foolish, like cutting taxes while conducting 2 wars at the same time. Now, Congress doesn't actually have any money, so the request for additional spending gets passed over to the Treasury Department. You may be surprised or dismayed, or perhaps neither, to learn that the Treasury Department essentially lives hand-to-mouth and rarely has more than a couple of weeks of cash on hand, if that. So the Treasury Department, in order to raise cash, will print up a stack of Treasury bonds, which are the means by which the U.S. government borrows money. A bond always has a face value, which is the amount it will be sold for, and it has a stated rate of interest that it will pay the holder. So if you bought a bond with $100 of face value and paying a rate of interest of 5%, then you'd pay $100 for this bond, and in a year you'd get $105 back. Treasury bonds are sold in regularly scheduled auctions, and it is safe to say that the majority of these bonds are bought by big banks and by sovereign nations such as China and Japan. The money that is used to purchase these bonds then gets sent to the Treasury Department's coffers, where it is distributed for the usual array of government programs. I promised you I'd show you how money first comes into being, and so far that hasn't happened, has it? The bonds are being bought with money that already exists. So where does money come from? Money is created by this next mechanism where the Federal Reserve buys a treasury bond from a bank. If you've been wondering what the so-called quantitative easing, or QE programs are, this next bit describes them. When the Fed buys a bond from a bank or other financial institution, they simply transfer money sufficient to cover the cost of the bond to the other bank, and then they take possession of the bond. It's that simple. A bond is swapped for money. The Fed has the money, the bank has the bond, and they are exchanged. Now, where did the Fed get the money to buy the bond? I'm glad you asked. It literally comes out of thin air as the Fed simply creates money when it buys this bond. Such newly created Fed money is always exchanged for a debt instrument, be that a treasury bond, a mortgage-backed security or MBS paper, or even corporate debt on rare occasions. So we can now put the title on this page. Don't believe me? Here's a quote from a Federal Reserve publication entitled "Putting It Simply." When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. Wow, that is an extraordinary power. Whereas you or I need to work to obtain money and place it at risk in the markets to have it grow, the Federal Reserve simply prints up as much as it wishes, whenever it wants, and then loans it all to us via the U.S. government, with interest. Given the fact that over 3,800 paper currencies, and a few metallic ones, have been rendered worthless due to mismanagement, wouldn't it make sense to keep a very close eye on whether or not the Federal Reserve is acting responsibly with our own monetary unit? What if they're overdoing it and printing too much? Because this is such an extraordinary power to have, we really should pay close attention to what they're up to. Alright, so now we know that there are two kinds of money out there. The first is bank credit, which is money that is loaned into existence, as we saw before. Bank credit is a type of money that comes with an equal and offsetting amount of debt associated with it, debt upon which interest must be paid. The second type of money is printed out of thin air, and that's what we see here at this stage. The process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled, so don't worry if you need to review this chapter several more times. I've had some people tell me that they've reviewed this section 4 or more times before it really began to sink in. However, if you understood all that and get it, congratulations. Give yourself a hand, because it's not easy. These monetary learnings allow us to formulate two more extremely important key concepts. The first is that all dollars are backed by debt. At the local bank level, all new money is loaned into existence. At the Federal Reserve level, money is simply manufactured out of thin air and then mostly exchanged for interest-paying government debt. In both cases, the money is backed by debt. Debt that, of course, pays interest. From this key concept, we can formulate a truly profound statement, which is that, at a minimum, each year enough new money must be loaned into existence to cover the interest payments on all of the past outstanding debt. If we flip this slightly, we can say that each year all the outstanding debt must compound by at least the rate of the interest on that debt. Each and every year it must grow by some percentage. Because our debt-based money system is growing by some percentage over time, it is an exponential system by its very design. A corollary of this brings us to our second key concept, which is that the amount of debt in the system will always exceed the amount of money in the system. So, if there's always more debt in the system than money, and the interest to pay off the debt must be loaned into existence, well, that too deserves at least a few minutes of your careful attention. It's not my role here to cast judgment on the system and to say if it's good or if it's bad. It simply is what it is. By understanding its design, though, you will be better equipped to understand that the potential range of future outcomes for our economy are not limitless, but rather bounded by the rules of the system. And that system is one that is designed to increase by some percentage, in this case the rate of interest on all the outstanding debt, over time, at a minimum. That is, our money system is designed to expand exponentially. That is a feature of our money system. Whether we happen to believe this is a good thing or a bad thing does not change the fact that this is simply how our money system is designed. All of which leads us to another key concept, which is that perpetual expansion is a requirement of modern banking. Not a legal requirement, but a systemic requirement, like your body as a system requires oxygen. In fact, we can make a rule. To avoid cascading disruption, each year new credit or loans must be made that at least equal the amount of all the outstanding interest payments that year. Without a continuous expansion of the money supply, past debts would not be able to be serviced, and defaults would ripple through and possibly ruin the entire system. Defaults are the Achilles heel of a debt-based money system, which we saw in our local banking example in the previous chapter. Because of this, all the institution and political forces in our society are geared towards avoiding this very outcome. So the banking system must continually expand, not necessarily because it's the right or wrong thing to do or because some law requires it, but rather simply because that's how it was designed. Continual expansion is a feature of the system, just like using gasoline is a feature of my car's engine. I might wish and hope that my car would run on straw or water, but I'd be wasting my time because that's just not how it was designed. By understanding the requirement for continual expansion, we are in a better position to assess whether that's even possible, and if we think that it's not, then we're free to imagine what might come next. I personally have my doubts about the long-term viability of a system that must expand exponentially forever, but which ultimately lays claim to the resources of a finite planet. So the question is this: what happens when a human-contrived money system that must expand by its very design runs headlong into the physical limits of a spherical planet that has only so much to offer? Someday, sooner or later, our monetary and economic models will collide with physical realities. One more belief I happen to hold is that I will witness this collision in my adult lifetime, and in fact, it has already started. And I am extremely interested to see how this is all going to turn out. Now, this is, admittedly, a truly gigantic proposition to consider, and some would say it's not very interesting at all, but rather frightening. Well, if you want the future to look just like the past, then it really is frightening. But if you are flexible in your view of the future, then you have an opportunity to make the most of whatever future actually arrives. These are fascinating, invigorating, and truly unprecedented times, and I, for one, am thrilled to be living right now, right here, with you. In the next...
Alright, so we'll leave that one there, but hopefully if you could stick with that whole, those couple of clips, and hopefully you were able to get a bit out of it. If you didn't take it all in, don't worry, because all we're going to try and do now is just pull a few little points out of each one just to help our understanding and put some context behind what's going on in the world around us. Because in reality, what we've just considered is how all money comes into being. We've seen that the Federal Reserve, this is the American model, which is mirrored throughout the Western world, creates the money out of thin air, exchanges it for government bonds, and that's how the Fed introduces money to the banks. And then the banks then lend it out to people, and it's multiplied by that fractional reserve system, and it goes through the whole economy and to individuals and businesses. But the whole point that we want to take away from this is that all money is backed by a piece of debt. That's a very hard concept for a lot of people to get. If you get a $50 note out of your wallet, that $50 is backed by an equivalent $50 amount of debt in the system. It has to be that way because of the very nature of how the system works. And the main point to get out of that is because that's the way that the system works, every year enough new money must be created to service all of the interest from the previous year's debt. And that's a bit hard to get your head around, but that then helps to explain why the world works in the way it does. And just to prove to you that this system's actually, or what I've explained to you is actually how the system works, I've just got a chart there of the actual United States money supply as of the 31st of December 2014. And as was stated in that previous video, the money supply there is about $10 trillion, where the debt is about $40 trillion, and that's exactly how the video clip was explaining to us that the system has to work. There's always going to be more debt than money in the system. Another question for you: why do governments hate cash? Have you ever noticed that the governments of this world hate cash? Why do they hate it so much? Well, the first reason is they can't tax it. If you go and get paid in cash and then you go down the shop and spend the cash and you don't declare it to the tax office, well, they have no way of taking their taxes off you. But that's only part of it. You see, the other part of it is that governments understand that if your money doesn't get deposited into a bank so it can be lent out to somebody else and then deposited into another bank, they can't expand the money supply. And if they can't expand the money supply, they realise that the whole system actually implodes upon itself. Have you ever wondered why governments are so hell-bent on making sure that our economy grows every year? Have you noticed that? We need economic growth. They go, we only grew by 0.2% this year, we needed 2% growth. And you're sitting there going, well, what would be so bad if our economy just stayed where it was? Surely that wouldn't be a bad thing. Well, in actual fact, if our economy stays exactly where it is, over a period of time, we will eventually just go bankrupt because of the very nature of the system. The whole system will default and implode upon itself because there's not enough new money being created each year to service the interest on all the outstanding debt. And I know it's a bit hard to get your head around, but it all starts to make sense, doesn't it, when you think about it? Why is it, brethren and sisters, that most of us are in more debt now than we were 10 years ago? Maybe not as individually, but collectively. Why is it now that we have to basically have two people in a family working just to get by, where 20 years ago you could only have one person working? It's because of the way the system is designed. It's because it is an exponential system that has to grow every single year. But the point is, it's mathematically impossible for something to grow indefinitely. At some point it reaches its limits and it comes crashing down upon itself. And what I've got there, and just quickly, the progress of the global financial crisis, it always starts in one place and then moves its way through the system. In 2007, 2008, it started off with individuals who couldn't pay their houses off. It then flowed through the system. We had mortgage lenders going broke, mortgage banks, investment banks, other industrial companies like General Motors going broke. And now we're at the point where small countries are starting to go broke. Back a few years ago we had Ireland, Iceland and Dubai go broke, and now we've got Greece, and shortly Spain, Portugal and Italy will all find themselves in trouble again. And we'll see that this will just continue to work its way through until Europe itself will be in more trouble. It's already in a lot of trouble now, and eventually the United States of America will be in trouble. And we'll see that a bit further on when we consider the level of debt. So the point is, we're 7 or 8 years into a process that will definitely be worked out over the next few years. So the question is, how does all this fit into Bible prophecy? It's not very common that you would come to a current events talk and talk about money for most of it, and some people might actually say, well, we probably shouldn't do that. But I just want to try and show you how I believe this all fits very nicely into what the Bible tells us is going to happen. And we're just going to move over it quickly. My intent is not to go into this in any great detail. But essentially, when we're looking at Bible prophecy, there's always a couple of these really massive prophecies, if you like, that we always spend a lot of time on. Ezekiel 38 and Daniel chapter 2. And the reality is they're speaking to us of an alignment of nations that we expect to see when Christ returns. Now the reality in the world since the end of World War II has been that the United States has been the dominant economy in the world. And as such, they've really had control of the world. They've issued the world's reserve currency, they've had the largest army, and for a lot of that time they've had the most amount of output, if you like, through their manufacturing. That's all starting to change. But essentially, the Bible portrays a certain alignment of nations when Christ returns. The reality at the moment is America, as the dominant nation, excuse me, which controls our money, is holding a lot of nations basically to ransom, if you like. So, for example, have a look at Europe versus America at the moment. Europe is completely tied at the hip to America by virtue of our financial system. The Bible says that Europe needs to be more aligned with Russia. So what's going to happen? Well, the reality is, for the Bible to be proven to be correct, we need to see a huge change in the way the financial system works. And we're starting to see that now, as a lot of the European countries are starting to go broke, and the benefits that they once enjoyed from being aligned with America are reducing substantially every single year. So from a big picture perspective, we see that what's happening in the financial system and the cracks that are starting to appear give us confidence that these prophecies are going to come to pass, because the alignment of nations will dramatically change as the financial system as we know it begins to fall apart. Daniel 12 verse 1 talks about that time of trouble such as never was. And it says, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even at that same time. And we know, don't we, from this place and others, that there's going to be a whole heap of events that take place, and they gradually get us to a point where we're going to have a time of trouble such as never was upon this earth. We also have the analogy of a woman in travail, where the contractions will start, and those contractions will get closer and closer and closer together. They'll get more and more intense as time goes on, and they'll draw it all to a focal point, which is this time of trouble such as never was. What about the frog-like spirits? I want to spend a couple of moments on these. Revelation 16 verses 13 and 14. And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. So what are these frog-like spirits? Well, first of all, they're spirits like frogs. They represent a certain way of thinking. We have a description there of where this way of thinking comes from, or where it's going to come out of. But what's the end result of this way of thinking? Well, this way of thinking is going to go forth to the kings of the earth and of the whole world, so it's going to affect everyone, and it's going to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. So we have a way of thinking that over a period of time will go forward, change the way people think, and the outworking of that way of thinking is it will bring them to the great day of God Almighty. The start of verse 14 says, for they are the spirits of devils. In the New Testament, this whole idea of devils has this whole idea of a mental illness, a sickness. It's a spirit of insanity, a spirit of madness, if you like, that goes forth. And this spirit of madness has the result of infecting everyone and bringing the nations to the great day of God Almighty. So what are these frog-like spirits and where do they come from? Well, if we have a look at our traditional understanding of the frog-like spirits, which is spot on, their origins go back to the French Revolution. The cry for liberty, equality and fraternity that came out of that period. And if we follow it through history, we realise that in this day and age, it forms humanism. And if you really would like to follow that through, compare these 3 documents. The Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in 2000, and you'll see that they all contain the same. Okay? And this whole cry of liberty, equality and fraternity has flowed through the ages and is found very much in the days that we live. So what is humanism? If you have a look at humanism and try and figure out what it means from a dictionary perspective, they will tell you that it is a system of thought that focuses on humans and their values, capacities and worth. It puts humans at the top. One of their catch cries is that in the beginning, man created God. See, humanists don't believe that there is a God. The whole notion of God was imagined by man. It's not real. So man is at the top. Humanists focus on self. It is all about making the most of you. You are the most important thing out there. You only have one life and you should make the most of it. There's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no afterlife. There's just here and now, and you need to go out and make the most of it. Humanism is everywhere. It affects all areas of our society. Education, media, politics, art, architecture, religion, music. It is absolutely everywhere. It permeates all aspects of our society. And I put it to you, brethren and sisters, that these frog-like spirits, or the humanistic way of thinking, this spirit of madness, also has infested the finance system. How is that possible? Well, the whole financial system is one that requires perpetual growth every single year. Everything that we're taught about money is that you need more of it. You need to have everything. You need to buy it now. Don't wait for tomorrow. Get the new car because you deserve it. You are worth it. Go and get the new house. 3 bedrooms is not enough anymore. You've got to have 5. Got to have the holiday every year. Don't worry about saving for it. Finance it. Get debt because debt is good. If you want to prosper in this life, you borrow money. You borrow as much money as you can and you spend it. Don't buy 1 house, buy 5. Don't buy a couple of shares. Go and borrow some money and get millions of shares. And on and on and on it goes. This is the frog-like spirit way of thinking, and just one area where it's manifested is in the financial arena, where we have been led to believe that the only way to live, that the only way to get ahead, and the only way to be successful in this life is to put everything on credit, to use debt to get everything that we can. Life is to be lived now, and we are to get as much out of it as we can. And if you go outside of this building, we all know this is true. Our whole system is set up and viewed in this way. But the reality, brethren and sisters, is that the frog-like spirits provide an illusion of freedom. Their catch cry was never real, it was always an illusion. Originally it was liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, get your rights, have it all now. What does it achieve for people? It's not real. In the end, all this way of thinking does is enslave people. And so it does in the financial arena, whereas we now have a society that is so indebted. The promise was freedom. The promise was have it all now and enjoy this life. And we now have a generation of people who are debt slaves, who can never pay off the money that they have borrowed because they wanted everything right now. And we see before our very eyes the frog-like spirits being played out. And the whole point of this way of thinking is that it will gather the nations to war. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep going. United Europe. As Christadelphians, we've been quite excited since the early 2000s about Europe coming together and forming United Europe, as it were. And I've had quite a lot of people over the last few years, sort of, they speak to me like they're concerned because we're starting to see cracks appearing in United Europe. Like it's a bad thing, you know. Is Greece going to leave? You know, well, isn't that going to throw Bible prophecy all over the place? Because, you know, Europe should be coming together. Brethren and sisters, we have to look at the detail of these prophecies. Daniel 2 gives us a very clear description of what will happen in Europe. And as was discussed earlier this morning, we don't need to get fixated on having an understanding of exactly how it's all going to play out, because as we know, sometimes things don't happen exactly as we thought they would. But the reality is we're given enough information to understand what's going on in Europe. Daniel 2 verses 42 to 43. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together. Once again, the detail. I've got the ESV translation up there. It just put this very, very well. I love that bit there. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, the feet of the image representing, as you know, this uniting of the nations. So they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together. And we don't know exactly how this whole situation in Europe is going to play out at the moment. It appeared for a little while there that Greece was going to get kicked out of United Europe, or out of the Eurozone. It now looks like, as of today, that they might get a third bailout and they'll stay in. But tomorrow it might have changed again because one country wasn't happy with the agreement. But we need to understand this is like a fractured marriage, brethren and sisters. We're told there's going to be all kinds of tumult within that region. And we should not be surprised at all that we're seeing all of these things take place. If anything, it is just another confirmation that the Bible is correct. Because it told us specifically that yes, it would come together, but it was not going to work. And what we have is this unbelievable web of debt throughout Europe. You can just see there, and really we don't need to go into the numbers. I had a little clip, but we haven't got time to go through it there. And you can just see that all the countries in Europe, they all owe each other money. And they're all broke. How can one broke economy pay back another broke economy the money that the broke economy lent that other broke economy? Like it doesn't work. It's impossible for this web of debt to ever be unwound. It is so complex, so complicated, and the amounts involved are staggering. No one has the money. And the reality is, now it's the leaders of Europe. They're like the blind leading the blind, going round and round in circles, going from one crisis to the next. And what Europe is finding out very clearly is that the American monetary system that they've embraced so strongly over over recent history has completely not worked for them. And I'm just going to show you a little clip now that basically was from last week. And the clip is of a gentleman called Nigel Farage, amazing politician. I can't stand most politicians because they lie. Nothing that comes out of their mouth actually makes any sense at all. This man came out of obscurity a few years ago. He's now the leader of the UK Independence Party. And this man gets in front of people and he speaks the truth. He actually says what's really happening. And it's really exciting when you see somebody that has an understanding of these things having the courage to speak out. I just want you to hear what this man said last week about what's going on in Europe, and think about what you know of Daniel 2.
And now Mr Farage for the FD Group.
Thank you. What we're seeing in this chamber this morning, and indeed across the whole of Europe, is an irreconcilable cultural difference between Greece and Germany, a split between the north and the south of Europe. The European project is actually beginning to die. Nobody in this room will recognise that, but actually the peoples of Europe are saying we were never asked whether we wanted this. This has been foisted upon us. And we need to understand why EMU doesn't work. Those monsters, Kohl and Mitterrand, backed up with a clever but dangerous Delors, believed that if they put in place an economic and monetary union, then as night follows day, there would be political union, that there would be an acceptance of this project, that the north and south of Europe would converge, that we'd all start to love each other, that we'd all begin to feel a European identity, that we'd all begin to show allegiance to the flag and the anthem. Those of us, of course, that criticised this were told that we were extremists and we lacked vision. Well, one vision we didn't lack is we understood that the countries of Europe are different, and that if you try and force together different people or different economies without first seeking the consent of those people, it is unlikely to work. And the plan has failed. This isn't just Greece we're talking about today. The whole of the Mediterranean now finds itself in the wrong currency. And yet virtually nobody in the political arena has got the courage to stand up and say that. Indeed, I feel that the continent is now divided from north to south. There is a new Berlin Wall, and it's called the euro. And the old enmities have been resumed. Just listen to the way that the German leader of the Christian Democrat group this morning attacked Mr Spiras. I think it was absolutely disgusting, but it shows the way north and south now feel about each other. Mr Tsipras, your country should never have joined the euro. I think you acknowledge that, but the big banks, the big businesses and big politics forced you in. Goldman Sachs, the German arms manufacturers, they were all very happy. And when the bailouts began, they weren't for the Greek people. Those bailouts were to bail out French, German and Italian banks. They haven't helped you at all. And these years of austerity, these years of high unemployment, of increasing poverty, none of it's worked. In fact, your debt GDP ratio has gone from 100% at the start of the crisis to 180% right now. It would be madness, sir, to continue on this course. You have been very brave. You called that referendum. When one of your predecessors tried to do the same, the bully boys of Brussels had him removed. They tried their best again. Mr Juncker said you would have to leave the euro and leave the European Union. Even Mr Schulz, the President of the Parliament, who one would have thought might be neutral, said that if the Greeks voted no, their power supplies may even go down. There were threats and bullying, but the Greeks stood firm. But, sir, you cannot have your cake and eat it. They will give you no more, these people. They can't afford to. If they give you more, they'll have to give other Eurozone members more. So your moment has come. And frankly, if you've got the courage, you should lead the Greek people out of the Eurozone with your head held high. Get back your democracy. Get back control of your country. Give your people the leadership and the hope that they crave. Yes, it'll be tough for the first few months, but with a devalued currency and with friends of Greece all over the world, you will recover.
Okay, so that was just a bit of what happened just last week in the European Union Parliament. So if you think about what was being said there, though, it's quite amazing, because I love the point where he pointed out, he said, look, it would be madness for Greece to continue in the Eurozone. And what have they done over the weekend? Come back and accepted a third bailout, where they're basically giving up all the sovereignty of their country. They're actually giving all the country's banks to another third-party entity. They're having to give up a lot of their buildings and all this kind of stuff. It's complete madness for them to do what they're doing, but the frog-like spirits were a spirit of madness. The spirit of madness is going to go right through our society, so that when we stand back and look at the decisions that are being made, it makes no sense to us. And yet that's what we're told was going to happen. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the king shall be partly strong and partly brittle. If that hasn't been fulfilled perfectly right now, brethren and sisters, I don't know when it will be. The iron power of Germany. Look at it coming through. It's partly strong and partly brittle. Unbelievable. All right. A couple more minutes left. I'm going to rush through this little bit on America because this, to me, brings this whole section together. We're looking at America because America is the biggest economy in the world. It has the world's reserve currency. We want to have a look at what kind of situation America's in, because if you look at the media, we're told that they're doing really, really well. Everything's just improving. Stock markets are at an all-time high. How can things be getting worse? Well, I just want to show you some of the numbers. If you have a look at America's national debt right now, it's $18.3 trillion. Population of America is 321 million. So if you divide the debt by the number of people, each citizen in America owes just under $57,000 of the national debt. Not that much, really, if you think about it. Or is it? That's on top of everything else everyone owes. But not everybody works, do they? Because that's for every man, woman and child. The debt per taxpayer, or the people that actually generate income and have the ability to pay off the debt, it ends up being $154,000 per person. It's getting up there. Most concerning thing, though, is the national debt of America has continued to increase an average of $3.95 billion per day since 2007. And this is the best economy in the world, so we're told. Let's have a look at the current US national debt. That picture there is a pile of money that represents the US national debt. I actually took this a couple of years ago when it was $15 trillion. As we just saw, it's now $18.3 trillion. It's going up every single year, the amount of debt. Any surprise? Well, not after we considered that our whole monetary system requires that there is going to be more debt every single year, because that's the way it's designed. But on top of the debt of the actual government, we have something which is called unfunded liabilities. And what these simply are, this is money that the government has committed to spend, but they've put nothing aside to actually pay for it. Things like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, which is the stuff that goes on in America. So they've promised to do all these things for the nation, but they've got no money set aside to do it. And the point is that all of those bills will come payable in the future, and you need to have the money, and there's no plan to have that money set aside. And the argument is, well, we don't have to set it aside because if we change the law, we don't have to do it. Well, that'd be like in Australia cancelling Social Security. What would happen if all the family tax benefits went out the window and the age pension went out the window overnight? The economy would crash, because most families rely on their family payments to pay their mortgage. You take that away, no one can pay their mortgage, housing market crashes. Pensioners can't afford to live, so the government has to supplement them some other way. The point is, these bills have to be paid. Right now in America, unfunded liabilities are $205.5 trillion. Add that on top of personal debt, business debt, local government debt, state government debt, the actual US government debt, and it works out there's close to $800,000 per person in America that they all owe. Physically and mathematically impossible for them to actually do it. And there's a pile of money that represents that number. To put it into perspective, 43 US presidents from 1789 through to 2008 spent a combined total, or a combined total of $6.3 trillion in debt. In President Obama's first term, he added $6.5 trillion in debt to the US government. This is an old slide. Obama's now in his second term, and he's not even at the end of his second term, and he's nearly run up another $6 trillion in debt. As we saw, the national debt's over $18 trillion now. So 43 presidents, $6.3 trillion. This one man has nearly racked up twice as much debt as all the 43 presidents before him. That's the very nature of our exponential system. Everything works well, brethren and sisters, while the system just grows at a nice rate. We're prosperous, and from the 70s right through, things were really good. It expanded well. Prosperity went out to all peoples. But then we've got to the point now where the debt is expanding at such a rate that we just can't physically keep up with it all. It's just growing so fast every year. We've all got to work so much harder just to keep on top of it all. You know, if America was actually paying off its debt, it might actually be all right. But here's the reality. There's only been 6 years since 1929 that government has actually paid any money off the debt that it owes. And all of those 6 years were before 1960. So since 1960, the United States government has not paid a single cent back in the money that it's borrowed from people. Every year it borrows more new money just to pay the interest on all the debt that it borrowed previously. That would be like me making my mortgage payments with my credit card. That's exactly what the governments of this world are doing. Australia's doing it right now. Before the recession, we had $20 billion sitting in cash. The government now reckons we're up to, I think it's $500 billion in debt. Sorry, 500 billion, yeah. All countries are doing it. And you think about it, how long would we last as individuals if every time our mortgage became payable, we swiped the credit card to pay that mortgage payment because we didn't have any money to do it? Well, eventually the limit on the credit card runs out and you are bankrupt. If that's not an exponential chart of debt, I don't know what is. That's the American debt since 1900. Another way of looking at it, the debt is going exponential, but the income is not really changing a great deal. Everybody says that Greece is a basket case, that it's going broke, it's collapsed. Well, guess what? Even using the most conservative figures, each citizen in America owes more money than the Greek people. So why then is Greece in such a bad state, when the largest economy in the world is actually in a worse position when you actually do the same calculations? And down the bottom there, you probably can't read it, but it says, under President Obama's plans, gross federal debt alone would reach $75,000 per capita in 2022. So it's not like they're trying to fix this problem. There's nothing in place to make this any better. By 2022, even using these conservative numbers, the debt per person has gone up by another 70-odd%. Now, as I said before, the reserve currency status of America is one of the main reasons why it's continued as long as it has. But if you go back through history, you find that that privilege doesn't last forever. 6 countries have enjoyed that privilege since 1400, but it doesn't last very long, and you can see from that time period there that America is very quickly approaching a time when the world will no longer allow it to issue the world's reserve currency. I put it to you that that's already happening. It's accelerating this year. As soon as that happens, our entire financial system will cease to operate the way that it currently does, because it's fully backed by the United States dollar. So we've looked at Greece, we've looked at Europe, we've looked at America. Debt levels across the entire world are accelerating continually. That chart's only up to the end of 2014, but it just keeps going higher and higher. On top of this, we have something called derivatives. You don't need to understand what they are, it starts to get more and more complicated. But the point is that you have money, which comes into existence because of debt. The debt grows every year at an exponential level, and then the bankers in their wisdom on top of these levels of debt issued these instruments called derivatives. The only problem is when the debt defaults, so does the derivative. Why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because the Bank for International Settlement says that derivative exposure has reached a high of $1.24 quadrillion. So if we thought the numbers were big when we're dealing in the trillions, derivative exposure is in 2007-2008 was $1.24 quadrillion. As of today, it's estimated that the actual gross figure is now $1.5 quadrillion. These are numbers that no one can mathematically ever contemplate us ever being able to deal with. All the assets in the world don't even come close. And if you considered the whole world as a business and you tried to write some financials for them and give them to a bank, they just put a line through it and say you're bankrupt. The entire world is bankrupt by any objective measure that you want to use to assess it. And Warren Buffett famously said that derivatives are financial weapons of mass destruction, carrying dangers that while now are latent, they are potentially lethal. And the whole point is the structure is such that what we've done over the last 15 years is got our financial system and lifted off the ground by the use of derivatives. And it's now swinging high in the air. And while everyone in this room has enjoyed their houses going up in value, it's only gone up in value because of the way the financial system has been leveraged and through this massive increase of debt. People just think that their house just magically goes up in value. It doesn't. It goes up in value because there's more debt around. You can't have prices going up without more debt in the system. The problem is that as people default and things start going wrong, it's like a cable snapping on a suspension bridge. Have you ever stopped to wonder why the governments of this world are so keen to bail out any bank, any institution that gets in trouble? It doesn't make any sense until you understand the fact that if they let people fail, the whole system comes crashing down. It's cheaper to bail out a bank than it is to let those defaults ripple through the system and affect the entire structure. What's wrong with printing money out of thin air? Sounds so basic, doesn't it? Well, in the end, the whole system implodes upon itself. So as we bring it to an end, brethren and sisters, the question is, where are we heading? No matter how you look at it, we're heading off the edge of a cliff. I don't know when. I'm not telling you it's going to happen this year, or next year, or the year after that. I don't actually know. The reality is, I thought it would have happened 5 years ago. I can't believe we've got along this far. And I remember I was chatting to another brother about this who really understands this stuff really, really well, and he said, hey, it doesn't make any sense why we've got this far. There's nothing you can look at that actually explains how we've been able to get as far as we have. And he said, well, it's basic. The day has not arrived. We know that the time appointed is set in stone. We're just waiting for it. We just don't know where it is. That day has not arrived just yet. Everything's in place, brothers and sisters. This structure will implode within 24 hours once it starts to go. The governments in power know that. That's why they're so petrified of what's going on. We are going to head off the edge of a cliff. It's time for us to get our heads around that. And the reality is, whenever collapse like this happens, it always leads to one thing, and that's war. And once again, that should come as no surprise to anyone, because that's exactly what the Bible tells us is going to happen. So what's the conclusion then? Just a few takeaways on money. All money is loaned into existence and therefore backed by debt. Each year enough new money must be loaned into existence to cover the interest on all the past outstanding debt. Debt must grow exponentially, and there's always more debt than money in the system. If you can take away those things, it helps to explain a lot of what's going on in the world at the moment. Perpetual expansion is a requirement of modern banking, and the question is that even possible? So brethren and sisters, when these things begin, when they begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh.